My name is Sara Denby. I am head of the Unstereotype Alliance Secretariat at UN Women, and it's my absolute pleasure to be here today to moderate this fantastic panel in their discussion. For those that aren't familiar, the Unstereotype Alliance is an industry-led initiative convened by UN Women that unites advertising leaders, decision makers, and content creators in our commitment to end harmful stereotypes in advertising and media content. Our global membership of 237 companies and 12 national chapters across the world is all combined in their intention to leverage their influence as a force for good to drive positive change in the world, particularly towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 5 for gender equality and SDG 10 to reduce inequalities of all people. Well, one of the most effective ways we can do that as an advertising industry is to push for positive, progressive portrayals of all people in our advertising and media content. But in the US, 53% of people say that they rarely see themselves represented in advertising. Globally, that number is 68%. So that's a lot of people who feel disenfranchised by advertising messages and invisible as consumers and human beings. So this perspective is even more prevalent amongst groups of people who exist in the intersection of more than one traditionally marginalised community, including those who live with a disability. One of the big challenges we have is that stereotypes are culturally driven. So we can't take a one-size-fits-all approach to tackling any of this. Stereotypes are nuanced in the US and across every market, whether it's race, ethnicity, age, ability, religion, socioeconomic status, you name it. And when you're a big global brand, this can become complex really fast. So it's a big job. We're not going to... Just blew up the sound system.
That was just to make sure everybody was alert.
Yeah. But I'm delighted to be talking today with a group of people who are wielding their influence in a really significant way in this space. With me on stage is Tristen Norman, who is Head of Creative Insights for the Americas at Getty Images. Nikki Darden, Head of Brand Engagement and Integration for Citi. And Ms. Scout Bassett, Paralympic track and field athlete, world record holder for the 400-metre T42 and holder of 2 America's records for the 100-metre and 200-metre T42. Few fans in the audience, it's going to be fun. Apart from that, last year on this very Adweek stage, Getty Images and Citi announced a joint endeavour to develop a series of global DE&I imagery toolkits to cultivate greater diversity and inclusivity of people in Citi's marketing and communications across 10 of its largest markets. So today we're going to hear more about this journey and learnings from the DE&I imagery toolkits and their implementation. You'll see a QR code up on screen so you can check out these fantastic toolkits for yourselves. And then we're going to talk about how we honed in on disability, in particular in the development of these toolkits across the world. So I want to start with you, Tristen and Nikki, to talk about the toolkits and what you discovered along the journey. Tristen, Getty Images is a member of the Unstereotype Alliance, and you know we're big believers in practical tools to help people advance positive portrayals in their content. It's one thing developing tools for a single market. It's quite another ball game when you reflect the cultural nuances of different markets. Race narratives very different in the US than they are in Brazil than they are in Singapore, for example. So tell us a bit about the toolkits and what you had to consider when you were developing them.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, that was the biggest impetus, I think, for both Nikki and I and all of our teams, was that we were having a lot of these conversations about diversity and inclusion worldwide, and yet we were finding that in some markets there were conversations that were really mature. In some markets, those conversations were still pretty nascent. And so we wanted to provide a comprehensive look at each of these individual markets and really identify what do we mean by when we say diversity in the United States versus Canada versus Japan. Who are those communities that are often marginalized or underrepresented in advertising? Who are those dominant identities and dominant forces in those communities, in those markets that we're looking at? And then we wanted to define what inclusion needs to look like based on what the visual landscape looks like. So, how are these communities that are underrepresented and or marginalized in some way, shape, or form being actually depicted in advertising? What are those dynamics that we need to solve for when we are entering a lot of these markets? Because we understand, as you say, Sara, that diversity and inclusion, that looks completely different in the US to Mexico to Singapore to UAE. And so we wanted to equip the community, when we started this project, it was just for the city teams, right? And then mostly more broadly, the advertising industry equipped them with the information, the insights, the data, the questions they need to ask themselves to make better choices and make the change that we knew that we needed to see in the industry.
Amazing. Thank you. And Nikki, we know that the teams responsible for producing content is almost as important as the content itself, because who makes the work is who shows up in the work, right? So since launching this project a year ago, how has that changed the way that Citi's teams operate around the world?
Yeah, thank you, Sara. So I'd say a couple of things. First, we had been putting diverse representation sort of at the forefront for quite some time with respect to our organization overall, but especially our marketing organizations in the different countries where we operate. But I think one thing I just want to point out is I think there was some level setting that needed to happen with our teams, where even diverse teams didn't realize that they weren't representing themselves in the work quite as prominently as one might think. And so we had this baseline of understanding of who we want at the table, but let's make it clear as to how there might be a disconnect from the work. But then beyond that, we as a firm overall at Citi have made, we first started in 2018, public representation goals around, in particular, Black people in the US, Black colleagues in the US, and women globally from a representation perspective. Since this work, we have been on a journey and we have evolved those goals, and those goals are now much more broad and much more global. And so we've made those commitments publicly. You can Google it. You can see exactly what targets we've committed to in specific markets and regions as well as globally. And we also have instituted, we'll call them targets for our agency teams. Because to your point, if we don't have the right folks in the room making the decisions around the work, we're not going to see that in the work. And the one thing I always like to add, our team works under sort of the motto, there can be nothing about us without us. So even when we don't have those folks on the team, we do think very actively around how do we bring them in to ensure that we're getting a really robust view of the world when we're creating.
I love that holding yourselves accountable and reporting on it in a really transparent way is the way a lot more firms need to go, I think.
Yeah.
So Nikki and Tristen, just to wrap this piece up, where do you feel brands are still missing the mark when it comes to authentic representation overall?
Yeah, I think, to start, there's a lot of appetite for improving diversity. There's an understanding similar to Citi and the amazing work that the Citi team are doing for making that change. But I think that change is not going far enough. There is an understanding that there's an issue, that we need to include many different communities, that diversity in our advertising is just kind of the name of the game. But I think we're still missing that second half of the equation, that inclusion part of the equation. It doesn't make a difference if you're representing people by the numbers. Say, for example, we have more representation of women in advertising than ever before, more representation of people of color more broadly than ever before. But if you're not representing them authentically, then you're going to still completely be behind the eight ball. You need to be thinking about how to humanize versus tokenize folks. And that's for communities who have made a lot of progress. We also know that for communities that are still not being thought about, who are treated as an afterthought, are people with disabilities in the first place, there is virtually very little representation of people with disabilities, people with LGBTQ identities beyond the month of June here in the US, people with different body shapes or sizes. So we need to be thinking about holding diversity and inclusion in our hands at the same time when it comes to this work.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add or really double down on is while we've been having these conversations for a while around diversity and inclusion, they have been fairly narrow, right? And so Tristen's point about people with disabilities is a good one. But in the toolkits, and I encourage everybody to download it, it's free. In the toolkits, we actually talk about 8 different lenses of identity. And I think as brands, we've really been very narrow in how we've thought about inclusion and authentic representation. And so really sort of broadening that spectrum of who's not seeing themselves and having the data to sort of prove that, listen, X% of the population identifies as this or has this lived experience, and they're missing from the work, or they're only shown very stereotypically in the work. That's where I think we can do a lot more.
Absolutely. And people with disabilities are one of the largest groups in the world, yet notably underrepresented in advertising and media. So Scout, I'll come to you next. You were involved in the early stages of this work with Citi and Getty Images. As an Asian American woman, a female athlete, and a person living with a disability, you're pretty much an intersectional unicorn in a lot of ways. You've worked with a lot of brands as a Paralympic athlete.
Yes.
Why was it important to you to be involved in this work, and how did Getty Images and Citi take an unusual approach with engaging you?
All right, so my experience is so phenomenal, and I want to say it's very rare. It's actually, with all the brands that I've ever been able to be associated or involved with, Getty and Citi, still to this day, are the only ones that brought myself and another Paralympic athlete at the very beginning and said, tell us how we should create our campaign. How do you want this ad to look? How do you want to be reflected in this campaign? What are the narratives, the storytelling that you want to be displayed? And I just remember being like, oh my gosh, I'm now an ad agency, but at the same time, it was incredible because so often people with disabilities are told, they plug you in this hole, we want to inspirationalize you, and that's just the role that we're told to play. And for myself and this other athlete to say, no, we want to be shown as powerful, we want to show our athleticism, how accomplished and talented we are, all the things that we have to offer that are not just our disability, was a game changer. And if you've seen the campaign, the images are stunning, they're powerful, they put the athletes in a very positive light, not this, so often with disability, it's this darkness to light sort of arc, right? And with the campaign, it's all light. And that's what I really loved. And I was just so taken away that they actually listened, and that along the way, the process, the development of the creatives, we got to see it, we got to provide feedback, and I wish more brands and companies would do that.
Yeah, amen. Nikki, that's a perfect segue to talking more about the fantastic Stare at Greatness campaign that Scout was a star of. So you all worked really hard to increase positive and authentic representation in this campaign, and it's such a powerful example of positive visual narratives. But what were the insights that led to this particular piece of work?
Yeah, I think Scout spoke to sort of the biggest thing that it's based on, and the team who created this work has just been phenomenal. I think you'll agree. And what this really hinged on is the insight that just think about it as yourselves, right? Think about yourself as a little kid. When encountering a person with a disability, what are you told? Don't stare, be polite.
Don't ask questions.
Don't ask questions. You sort of pretend that there are no differences between the people in the room. We do that across everything, by the way. We try to blend in and pretend that everyone's the same. We're not the same. And I think it's important to highlight that or focus on that because it's our differences that make us unique. And in this particular instance, the question is, do you tell that kid not to stare, or do you recognize that you just saw something phenomenal? You just saw a phenomenal athlete. Scout's a world record holder. You should stare. Like, that's crazy. So that's one thing. And then the other piece is that point about inspirational. This is something that I'll tell you, I was in a meeting the other day and I heard the inspirational word as we were talking about Disability Awareness Month. And I was like, ugh. And so of course afterwards I was like, hey, just wanna point out, like, everyday things. We shouldn't be, oh, you're such an inspiration. You're so, like, come on, stop it. So when we want to be inspired, let's show something inspiring. And that's really what this campaign does. It puts these athletes on the pedestal that they have earned because of their skill, their talent, and their hard work. And that's really the crux of the campaign. I think it comes to life so beautifully in the work.
I agree. It really does explode those traditional tired tropes. And I love that play on no stare at the greatness. This is, amazing. Tristen, what do you see as being the biggest gaps when it comes to representation of disability communities in media and advertising?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think that we want to celebrate athletes who have incredible skill, right? Who are dominating their field. But we want to also say yes and to other dimensions of representation for people with disabilities. You know, people with disabilities go to work, they love, they have families, they have friends, they have communities, they go to school, and yet you don't see that represented often in advertising. You either see an amazing athlete like Scout, or that inspirational story, or nothing at all. You do not see people with disabilities who have jobs, who are in the workplace. And we know from our research within the toolkits that one of the things that we were finding across different markets is that your disability has a lot of impact on your level of income, on your level of education, on the opportunities that you're able to have in life. And so when you are erasing certain communities, you're not showing certain communities as part of the kind of, oh, you know, they can be leaders in the workplace, or they can be managers and bosses in the ways that we know exist for many people with disabilities, then you're limiting the possibilities in folks' minds about what's possible for people with disabilities. And I think that those kind of nuances and layering those humanizing details into storytelling is so important for advertisers to think about. Yes, and.
Yeah, perfect. And Scout, you were one of the stars of the Stare at Greatness campaign. What would you like to see more of when it comes to representation of the disability community in advertising? And I want to know, what is it that still drives you nuts?
Well, one thing that I've noticed is growing up, I never saw people with disabilities in entertainment, in media, advertising. I only saw that in my adult life because I was the person in it. And what I noticed is the only other time I would see somebody with a disability were typically men. If you've looked at Game of Thrones, The Blade Runner, I mean, in media, and there was an Anne Hathaway movie that came out called Witch recently. They were largely men, and the men were celebrated as being heroes, soldier-like, courageous, bold, and we celebrated them in this very powerful way. And then women were casted in roles like Witch, and she's got deformed fingers, and she's an evil figure in the movie. Well, what does that say about women with disabilities, right? Or I didn't see people like myself at all. And when you did, it was that women were casted in these, like, their disability is their weakness and their deficiency. The thing that makes them not like what we aspire women to be, right? Which is this idea of bodily perfection. All the advertising that I've ever seen with women is about this idea of what beauty, desire, attractiveness looks like, and women with disabilities don't fit that role. So it's no wonder why we don't see women with disabilities in a lot of that outward-facing advertising, because you can't sell that as bodily perfection, as a form of something to strive for, right? And so that's what drives me crazy is, you know, we don't see that in a lot of the advertising, that a woman with a disability can be beautiful, can be powerful, and this is not her deficiency. It's not her weakness. In fact, I would argue that it is the very thing that makes her strong and powerful and worthy of having people looking up to. But so often that isn't the narrative that we tell about women with disabilities.
If I may, Sara, I think that that's such an important point, and you described Scout in the beginning as an intersectional unicorn, and I think that we often only can hold space for one dimension of identity at a time, and we need to move away from that. And so Scout made such an important point about representing women with disabilities. You're overwhelmingly seeing men with disabilities in advertising as well. Also, people of color, women of color, you often do not see women of color with disabilities in advertising. And then the ways in which they are presented, to Scout's point, is so either really narrow, they're not being defined as beautiful, they're not being shown as powerful or empowered in general.
Yes.
And these are the things that we need to be conscious of, because we are not all one thing at any given time. We're a whole host of things at any given time, and that's what advertising needs to reflect.
Absolutely. And we've talked about this a little bit previously, and what I find so important about this conversation, or this particular point, is that at the Unstereotype Alliance, we look to eliminate all stereotypes, so race, ethnicity, age, ability, religion, the works. But you cannot approach positive or progressive representations of anyone without applying the gender lens. Regardless of where they sit on the gender spectrum, and we're all roaming around on there somewhere. But the stereotypes that we're subjected to, and therefore the progressive representation of all people, are very different based on their gender. And you've pointed out, you know, the stereotypes of men with disability in media content and entertainment is very different to the stereotypes that women experience. So we have to be cognizant of that and think about it when we're looking to portray people in progressive ways, and particularly when it comes to visual narratives, right?
I want to give another example, and this has nothing to do with me being an athlete, but just being a woman. I cannot tell you the number of times I've heard in person, or I get messages on my social media that go along the lines of this: you're really pretty for somebody with a disability. And I mean, but I hear it, and I read messages like that all the time, and that tells me that society across the globe, our culture, has sort of been raised to see women with disabilities as unattractive, undesirable, not beautiful. And part of that is the advertising, because let's be honest, we don't see women with disabilities in those spaces as featured in a way where they are beautiful, they are strong, they are attractive, you know, and that's not what it's all about. But just the fact that I get those messages alone says that we think of women with disabilities as down here on the hierarchy, you know, and it makes me so sad. And I feel like there's such an opportunity for brands, for companies to really put women in a very different light that have disabilities.
Yeah, felt the whole room flinch with that one. But it is, it is something that we have to be allies around, right? We've got to speak up and speak out against those sorts of comments, because people say they don't realize, you know, they think it's a compliment.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, try harder, people. So yeah, I think these are all really important stories that we have to put out there. This is such a vital topic to help drive our respective industries forward, and to ensure that all are included in really authentic ways. So if we use the last 5 minutes to each take a little bit of time to for each of our panelists to say the one thing that they wish this audience would take away with them, to start thinking about from tomorrow or next week when they've left Adweek, New York, back at their desks, to help them convert intent into action in their work. So Tristen, I'm going to come to you first.
Oh, no pressure. I think the most important thing that you want to think about is what questions you can ask yourself about what choices you're making in your visuals now. this work, the change that we want to see happen, doesn't start overnight, and it also doesn't start without you taking a good, long, hard look at the work that you're doing. You know, how can you facilitate really important and powerful and brave conversations amongst your teams who are touching the visuals, the works that you're putting out into the world, and say, what ways can we do better? You know, are you tokenizing? Are you humanizing? Are you only showing certain types of disabilities in your work, right? There's a whole host of what disabilities can actually look like. There are visible disabilities, there are invisible disabilities, and there are a lot of people who exist in along the disability spectrum. You know, are you thinking about disabilities at different intersections of identity? So really asking yourself a lot of questions, really interrogating the work is incredibly important. I think you can do that actually this afternoon once you leave here.
Nikki.
I think, so first of all, I just want to acknowledge I grew up pretty for a dark-skinned girl, so I'm with you.
Yeah.
Got it. It's like, oh, thanks. To that point, though, one of the things that you see in the toolkit, information about colorism, as well as so many other dimensions that we don't talk about every day. And I think the folks in this room obviously are focused on this. You are intent around making these changes and learning more. That's why you're here. However, when you go back to the office, there's a whole organization of people who aren't as focused, not because they're not interested or they don't want to make change, but it's so much easier to continue with the status quo. That's how we make progress, unfortunately, at work. You got to get something out the door. And so I think one of the things that I'd love for folks to walk away with, and why I keep saying download the toolkit, is how do you remove those barriers from other people being able to adopt and adapt their work, right? So the toolkit is one of them, and education is one of them. One of the other things that we're doing with Getty is we're creating custom content so that our team takes the accountability for providing more authentic images to the rest of the organization. So it's not hard for them. They've got those tools. We've got a digital asset manager, a DAM. How do we ensure that we're tagging images in the DAM in a way that makes it easier for our colleagues to find it? So if we can focus on how do you remove the barriers for everybody else, so that those of us who are like-minded in this room can make sure that we can scale the change that we're able to drive.
Yeah, fantastic, thank you. And Scout.
Only 19% of Americans are currently employed with disabilities. Only 19% of people with disabilities are employed. Only 19% of college students have a disability. I'm not saying the two are directly linked, but you might see a correlation there. And what I want to say is the Stare at Greatness campaign is, obviously it features athletes because of Citi's partnership with the Paralympics, but getting the imagery out there, showing these athletes with disabilities out there is so much more than just about sport. What if a company was more comfortable seeing people with disabilities, whatever circles or community you're in, and maybe is able to provide an opportunity for somebody with a disability to be employed? Like, go back and ask your companies, the brands you represent, do we employ people with disabilities? Do we serve disability community groups? And not just to put an image, you know, it's that group photo where the wheelchair athletes front and center. And while that's wonderful, are you standing behind that? One of the things that I'm most proud of with the Citi partnership is that Citi's not only supporting the athletes, but they're supporting the NGBs that often don't get funding to be able to compete in sport. They're supporting the advocacy work of the athletes, the causes the athletes are behind. So, as Tristen said, not just to use them, to tokenize them, just to check a box so that we have an image and somebody with a disability is in the photo or in the ad, but what kind of storytelling are you doing around that person? What kind of initiatives or changes are you pushing through your advertising, through your campaign? And that's really what I want to challenge is you know, people with disabilities, as you saw in the statistics, there's 61 million adults living with a disability. and they're seen in less than 1% of all advertising. So often I hear from brands or companies, well, we don't really see a natural fit, or you don't really fit. And I say, or people with disabilities are such a niche market. 61 million people is not a niche market, and we make up 15% of the global population. So these are not niche groups. This isn't a small group of people, and yet they have so much power, and very few brands and companies are really talking to those, targeting that group. And so I just really encourage you to, as Tristen and Nikki said, ask yourselves, what are you doing or not doing, and be transparent about that, because people with disabilities provide so much perspective and unique life experience, valuable insight that brands and companies rarely ever think about, and rarely ever ask us about. But you have such an opportunity, and I just really feel like we're going to see some incredible change and momentum coming our direction. But thank you all so much for having me.
Thank you so much. I think that's what we call...
Oh, sorry, one more thing. And what I love about the campaign is, if you notice, the campaign has nothing to do with actual banking or the service of banking. And that's the other thing I hear. Well, our business doesn't really connect directly with people with disabilities. And that's what I love about Citi's approach, is that if you look at the approach, it's about purpose, it's about impact, and the campaign is a reflection of Citi's values, who they want to be as a company. We are a people company, we serve people, we serve all people. And so so often I think we got to get away from that cookie cutter of like, we're selling a product or a service or something. Sell your brand about what you're about. If you're about diversity and inclusion, really sell that, really include that, really be about that. And so that's like one of the unique things that I think all brands and companies can take away, is that it doesn't have to be directly tied to a product or a service. It can be about a mission, it can be about a purpose, and that's really what's important.
And that's what consumers are taking on board. I think that's what we call ending with a call to action. We are out of time, but thank you all so much for listening, to those here in the room and those watching online. And thank you so much to my fantastic panel, Tristen Norman.
Yes.
Nikki Darden. And Miss Scout Bassett. Please do use the QR code to download these fantastic toolkits. And thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of Advertising Week.